I'm John Travis here in Mullumbimby, New South Wales on the 18th of December, speaking to Robin Grille in Avalon Beach down near Sydney. Good morning, Robin.
Good morning. Hey, I maybe I'm in the wrong place. I thought I was with Jack.
That is true. My friends do know me as Jack.
I'm gonna have to be with Jack.
Well, all right.
Otherwise, I get confused.
I know. So what I'm going to do today, Robin, is grill you, the little pun on your surname, about who you are and why. And most importantly, why you are the paragon of infant wellness and parenting expertise. I remember Marin first reading your book and saying, "This guy gets it from a woman's perspective." And I know you've heard that from many other people, that your writing is profound. And I had the pleasure of editing your latest book, and I think it's even more profound. So when did you first have an inkling that you were going to go in this direction and not be a space cowboy or something like that?
Oh yeah, that was neck and neck. I was either going to be a psychologist or a space cowboy. I tell you, I wrestled over that one, and I decided to go for the field that has no money in it.
And
It's
how old
what
were you?
I think you know that line that you said about Mary. You know, this guy really gets it from the women's point of view. I'm smiling to myself in terms of almost black humor. You know, I think my mother probably said that about me very, very young, and I do have a sense. I kind of became her. I was enrolled into being her psychologist so very, very early that well, I mean, just to, I guess, to put it simply, for me, that's a scar, really. I still feel the burden of that. You know, it's difficult to find kind of freedom from that
Mm-hmm.
sense of having been subtly but quite powerfully used as a listening board.
Yeah.
But it you know, for my kind of survival as a kid, you know, if I saw my mum in pain, that I would stand there frozen and listening, because that's what she seemed to want from me. And you know, even to the point of telling me a lot of things that are really, really not for my ears, really not for a child's ears, you know, about her personal life and intimacy problems with my father, all kinds of stuff. That, you know, looking back, the only word I have for that is abuse. It's kind of emotional incest, really.
Yeah.
And I think for me, that's the sort of the wound side of how I came to psychology. You know, from a pretty horrible place. That was quite a crushing experience. And when I first contacted how heavy that was for me, I fell onto the ground face down and sobbing, really, just the sense of an elephant sitting on me. So, but somehow it's not the only influence, of course, but that's part of the kind of, and look, I'm really interested in how for so many people, what ends up being their vocational passion begins with almost a spear in the side,
Mm-hmm.
a terrible wound, a kind of a crack in the fiber of our connection with ourselves that sets us on a path of, you know, for me, of focusing my attention a lot on what is going on underneath the usual conversation for other people. So, I mean, that's not my only influence. I'm going to be fascinated with human psychology and relationships incessantly for as long as I live, because it's you know, I'm 59 and it just doesn't get old for me at all. It's still it means a lot to me. I get very excited about understanding the story of why things happen for us, and the story of how we, you know, of why we relate to the world in the way that we do. Very, very
I
rich.
think it was Elaine Sullivan who 30 years ago told me that she thinks our gifts come out of our wounds, which is exactly what you're describing. You
Oh
have
yeah,
a gift.
yeah.
You know,
I don't know if that's true for everybody everywhere, but geez, I think it's such a very common theme, right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Now, you have an unusual background of having grown up in Uruguay, and you say a little more about how that influenced your direction.
I mean, that's so unusual that most people think Uruguay is Paraguay, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah, I was born in Uruguay. My parents are Romanian Jews, were Romanian Jews, and like a lot of, quite a lot of Eastern European Jews after the war, after the Second World War, they migrated to Montevideo, the capital of Uruguay. And it was just a very unusually socially advanced and democratic little nation. Always kind of ahead of the game in South America in terms of stability and at least comparatively, right? I mean, they got rid of church power such a long time ago.
Mm.
It's the most secular nation in Uruguay, and that has, I think, that's probably the largest contributing factor to what a relatively stable nation that it is, peaceful and democratic, and well educated. So it was a magnet, and my parents migrated there after the war and after 4 years of communism in Romania under Nicolae Ceausescu, that monster.
Yeah.
And yeah, so I was born there. My brother and sister were born there. My elder brother and sister, and then when things got really messed up, when South America became like the kind of the battleground between the United States and the Russians, really, the Cold War, so much of it was being punched out on the South American football field. The CIA and everything else. It was a mess. It was violent, and the economy's plummeted. And so we moved to Sydney then. I've been here since 1971. I was about 10 years old when I came with my family.
Wow. Yeah. I think most Americans, the only thing they know about it was the movie that with Jack Lemmon about the Chilean coup that the U.S. was behind. But most of us are pretty ignorant of, like, I knew nothing about Uruguay other than we had to draw a map of it when we were in geography.
Well, yeah, that's and there's a lot of vested interest in American children in school never learning about, America is the good guy.
Yeah.
And clings to the image of being the good guy with absolute tenacity and despair. And my wife is an American. She went to school there, and left at 19 because of that, because she could smell the lie, that when she tried to learn history in school, it turned out to be American history and written by the good guys. And, I'm not polarized in that way. I love the States, and I love the music, and I love the contributions of the States. And in fact, most of the research that I've done comes from American social science, really. Fantastic things that go on in the universities. However, from the South American point of view and also the Australian point of view, gosh, we know, how much blood is in the hands of American institutions like the CIA and American. If you can say these days that a corporation belongs to a nation, which they don't, they have no loyalties at all. They're in it for themselves. But American-born corporations that have a history of incredible butchery throughout Latin America. Chile is only the obvious one and the most well documented, but it was the same all over. The same in Uruguay, the same story, the same military coup.
And isn't there
Yeah.
one going on right now? I just got an email this morning from Code Pink that they were had a 4-week blockade outside of an embassy that they were afraid was going to be shut down from another American coup. Forgotten, I think it was it Venezuela or one of the.
Yeah, certainly not in Uruguay. But do you know, I've forgotten that. Well, in Bolivia, actually.
It could be Bolivia. Yeah,
It's
I know that it's
incredibly
still going on.
Yeah, it's the exact same story still
Mhm.
going on, and yeah, it's kind of the cosmetic side of it might be a little bit different, but underneath it's the same really, where gigantic multinational corporations with the backing of American military and special forces and secret intelligence, they can count on that kind of weaponized backing whenever they want it, and so they do control political outcomes and economies, and there's a trickle up effect that goes on.
Yeah.
That
Well, we've
defies
gotten political
gravity.
here, a little off course from your childhood, though. You are a refugee of political regimes that, and you've moved progressively westward to the great state of Australia.
Well, do you know what? It sounded like we were off course, and you know where this links in for my work a
Yeah.
lot is that it's so easy for me to think politically and to think geopolitically, because that has always been the conversation around the dinner tables that I fed from, and
It's in your blood.
it's in my almost my DNA. You know, I was marinating in that, a lot of it because of my father was so explosive, and so he carried an enormous amount of unrecognized and untreated trauma from his time in the communist regime and the Second World War and being a Jew in Romania, and so he was, you know, wonderful guy in so many ways, but there was what came over him is Jekyll and Hyde. Incredibly shocking to watch how he would become somebody that was unknown to himself when a trigger came, and he would explode into a rage that would go on like a tirade for an hour or so about those goddamn communists or those goddamn Muslim terrorists or whatever it might be, the sort of the boogeyman of the day. But hard to be with, but it really focuses my attention to the point that I don't see psychology as separate from politics. I don't see the personal psychology at all as divisible from collective psychology. And I'm my training in psychology in the early days was about the family being a mom and a dad and a kid, and a couple of siblings, but like they've been cut out of the page, and as if that operates as a closed loop. And that to me is a completely delusional. There's we're so much more interconnected than that, and it's not mom and dad, it's much more than that in the conversation. So anyway, that's the way that pardon?
Not to mention the whole culture that we're enmeshed in. And
oh gosh, yeah, the whole culture. Yeah, we sometimes don't even know when we're speaking in a culturally conditioned language to each other.
Probably a lot more than I realize.
I think all the time.
Backing up to your developmental stages here, you came to Sydney when you were 9, so you would have been in what?
I was in what we call year 3 in Australian primary school. And by the way, I can't say that I was a refugee. you know, we were, I feel a little bit of kind of survivor's guilt about this, but our migration was golden. It's not that my parents were wealthy. They
Yeah.
were prosperous. They were okay, middle class kind of thing, I think, guess you call it. But no, it was in 1971 coming to Australia. It was a place of abundance and enormous opportunities for my dad as an engineer, and
Yeah.
he decided to make it a trip. You know, we flew, we island hopped across the Pacific, and it was a happy migration, I have to say. I didn't even notice how lost I felt, and how disconnected I was from my Spanish and my, you know, the culture that I was kind of familiar with. I didn't notice how much a loss I had inside about that, because it was so lovely to migrate, and Australia was so gorgeous, and beaches and all of that, and bush, and we stopped in Tahiti, we stopped in Fiji. It was, I have to say, an incredibly privileged version of migration. I can't be called a refugee for that.
In
I was
terms
lucky, yeah.
of leaving a much more connected Hispanic culture, if that's the right term,
Yeah.
the Latin connection is so much greater than the Anglo
Yeah.
disconnection that comes out of the Northern European. What I'm attracted to Italians because of my Viking background. You know, the
Yeah.
touching, the effusiveness. And so you're landed in Sydney now, and then you
Yeah.
suddenly realize, where'd all my friends go, and how was your English at that point?
I had gone to some English class. It got me through the day. I was in a school where there was a lot of migrants, so I didn't feel too ashamed of not being able to speak. And I picked it up really quick because I already had French and Spanish, fluent in both. So that came fairly rapidly for me. The thing that never really took with me is the usual stereotypical Australian way of being. You know, I've been a fish out of water about that all my life, and I'm not blessed with being good at sport. I'm atrocious at sport, and it matters in Australia to be good at sport when you're in high school.
Yeah.
It's socially costly to be clumsy at sport, right?
I remember that myself.
Yeah, right.
And I was 6'5" and expected to play basketball.
Yeah. Well, I couldn't hit a ball. I can hit anything around the ball, but not the ball itself. So,
then moving into high school, then, so did you make friends and build yourself a support network?
Yeah, I did. God, I didn't feel like I belonged. I think I just kind of wore some kind of I was lonely as hell in high school. Even though I was interacting and I had friends and we played and we laughed, but there was a deep sense of not belonging. And I'm really, high school was 6 years of trying to fake my conversations to see if I can make my conversations fit in with what worked, you know, so I could be part of the group. But what a struggle that was. And
I wonder if that's a lot more common than any idea, that no one's ever studied it, probably.
Oh gosh, it would be a huge study, just even to people, just to film, you know, ourselves opening up about it, because I go to high school reunions and all of the people that look popular are saying the same thing in a sense.
Yeah,
you know. But I was, you know, my interest was so very, very unusual. You know, and this is part of what got me onto psychology, that I was fascinated by anything that you would loosely call esoteric. So that's what I would go home to read. you know, things about astral travel and healing and telepathy and past lives and future lives and meditation and you know, things that I feel much more earthbound these days. I'm very, very skeptical. However, it had a meaning and a magic to that I would spend hours on my own. My friends that were closest to me were really the books that I would read. I don't know if anybody even knows about Lobsang Rampa anymore, and Edgar Casey, and a lot of it was totally fraudulent. But you know, it had a kindness to it. You know, that world, what you know, was called the New Age kind of stuff of the day in the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, presented, I guess, for me, at least an imaginary world where people are really, really kind to one another, and it's musical. There's music there, and you don't have to play sport. You don't have to beat each other up on the playground. You know, you can sit together, meditate, dance, make love, grow your hair long, and be connected with nature, and play your guitar. And the guitar was very, very interesting to me. My guitar was my friend also. I think my guitar saved me in high school from the, you know, the danger of being an outcast that would
Mm.
make you a target of violence, because playing guitar, if you're going to be lousy at sport, it gives you the image of this kind of the currency of cool.
Yeah.
That at least you got some cool if you got your hair long and you can, you know, aim a guitar in the right direction. And, you know, you can get by that way socially and survive and dodge the bullets. And I was a good singer. I'm still a pretty good singer.
Where were you in high school? What part of Sydney?
Oh, Ku-ring-gai High School, which is right on the edge of what, you know, one of the largest national parks on the north of Sydney, Ku-ring-gai Chase.
Oh.
And enormous. And the school had no fence. So that we would, truancy in Australia is called wagging class, wagging school. So particularly in senior high school, a bunch of us would just cross over into the national park after going to the class in the morning and disappear. Just you'd walk for half an hour through this magnificent eucalypt forest and end up in Bobbin Head Creek, and we'd be swimming in that and stay in the wild all day and just come back to catch the bus home.
Wow.
And so I missed a huge amount of high school that way, and I think my school was Ku-ring-gai Chase National Park, and swimming in the creek and being among the trees and the birds and
That's a
the
real
wildlife.
PE class.
I'm fond of it, you know. I'm grateful for that. It gave me a lot, and it gave me an escape from what to me felt like often the stupidity of authoritarian teachers that don't look at all happy to be there. You know, they're just getting by because that's the job that they can do, but they don't, you know, some of them were wonderful, but at least half of them had zero passion for their craft. And the classroom then was very, very oppressive. So I'm glad that I think nature spoke to me for a couple of years without words, in a way that went in and gave me something that
Yeah.
teachers could not.
So you managed
Yeah.
to graduate and go on to university, and I know you took
Yeah.
me around Sydney Uni
Yeah. I did graduate, you know, with a plunging disappointment in my marks to my parents, because my older brother and sister were both geniuses. They were academic, you know, like way off the scale, you know. So then there's a looming expectation of a Grille. You're a Grille, you know. So you're a
Yeah.
Grille. You're gonna absolutely, you know, you're gonna smash it at the high school exams. And I just passed by the skin of my teeth. And but in those days, university was free of charge. And with the marks that I had, I was permitted to go and do a Bachelor of Arts where I majored in psychology. And in this most beautiful university that I did show you here, Jack, as you were saying, we walked amongst it, these old sandstone buildings. And
Quadrangle, I thought it was in England.
because it was modeled on England, I think Scotland, a
Yeah.
Scottish university. So it does look very English. You know, it's so elegant and beautiful, those halls of learning. You know, the students there call it Hogwarts College now, since in the neo Harry Potter era, because it has that feeling to it. These gargoyles and stained glass and hidden corridors, and you know, the pathways are worn from, you know, 100 years of people walking on them. And for Australia, that's old. Okay, for Euro Australia, that's an old thing. So yeah, I was not a very good student there either. All I could think about was sex. More likely for me the lack of it most of the time, up until I met my first girlfriend there. And you know, I loved philosophy. I loved half of psychology and absolutely loathed the other half.
The
So,
statistics and that kind of stuff.
Statistics, I kind of survived. I had no love for it. You know, the training rats to run mazes, and that has something to do with who I am as a person, and you know, the requirement to electrocute a little lab animal, and basically everything to do with behaviorism. It made me feel like, do you know the Dementors in Harry Potter? They suck your soul out. You know, if you've ever read the books or watched the movie, behaviorism felt that way to me. Like it just sucked out my soul, you know. It was that visceral. And I finished my BA and I swore I would never practice psychology in another human being. And I quit after that. I didn't carry on to do my postgraduate. And then was, you know, lost basically vocationally for a few years, and trying out all kinds of appalling jobs that I had no love for. I think that's the time. Oh gosh, I mean, I was a accounts payable clerk for the National Crime Authority. Do you know, I've appreciated the pleasure of cleaning toilets by comparison to that job. You know, it was desperately depressing. Or I worked for market research companies for a while. You know, what have you got? You got a psych degree? Come and do market research. That means the world to me right now. You know, I get very, very upset about it. The vocational torture of young people. That, yeah, I feel very kind of political and very militant about it. That, you know, if I feel that if a school has not helped you to find your flow state, not help you to find what do you love love to do, your passion. It hasn't done that. Your school has been, for me, the word is educationally abusive. It's educational abuse. It's a failure of human beings, and I think it's one of the major causes of depression. That it's an epidemic throughout the entire capitalist world, really, and the rest, the modern world, the industrialized world.
Yeah.
That most people spend most of waking hours doing a kind of a job that they have no love for, that it has no meaning for them, and it's depressing, and it's so ruinous. Then that has ripple effects onto relationships, into how we parent our children. You know, the acceptance of drudgery in our lives, to the point that you don't ask the question anymore because everyone in your culture is saying that's normal.
Yeah,
that's what life is. So the cruelty that we don't identify as cruelty is the most destructive cruelty that there is.
And
It's
insidious.
most insidious.
Yeah.
So what awful damage that is, and it's all over the world. And
Normative abuse.
normative abuse.
Yeah.
That's one of the many kinds of normative abuse.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah. So I mean,
So what got you out of this morass of dead end cog in the machine to
yeah,
your passion?
there was some really exciting things going on in the 1980s in Australia. That you know, this was the beginning of this personal growth movement revolution. You know, that the kind of the intermingling of Eastern philosophies and practices, the meditation and the yogas and all of that stuff, you know, the martial arts from China and Japan and all of the philosophy that comes with that, the tantra, and that the world arrived at this point that Western psychologies started to grapple with that and to mix together. And I think California and New York were two crucibles where that potent mix became such a kind of a reaction, you know, like a nuclear fission. And that began to be exported, you know, and with all the good, the bad, and the ugly of it, you know, the sham gurus and the, you know, controlling people that harangue you from the front of a room, and, you know, but it was like the word workshop took on a new meaning. Workshop used to be where you got the tools to make stuff out of wood.
Yeah.
And now workshop, suddenly in the 1980s, is where you go. It was the first experience I had of what it means to be emotionally open and what it means to be sitting with other people who become intentionally vulnerable. And it felt like being born for me, like coming alive. This is what contact feels like.
What kind of workshops were you experiencing?
Well, my entry into that was, oh man, I mean, I got my first gig playing guitar and singing in a wine bar, and I panicked. I got frozen by, you know, stage fright before my first night. So I began by going to a counselor, a therapist, a psychotherapist, and had no idea what to expect. But, you know, I'd always been reading kind of esoteric literature and reading about psychology because it interested me. So I was able to sit with the strangeness of it all. And he ended up being a very unusual kind of rebirther and primal therapist. I didn't know what to expect, but we sat inside a wooden box that was a replica of a womb. It was all pink and soft and cushiony on the inside and dark. And he just sat with me in a kind of a meditational state, hearing me, but saying very, very little. I'll never forget it. And I was 19 years old or 20. And I just fell into this trance where I could hear deep, deep, wise things being said to me that really stirred me. And I couldn't understand it, but it was something told me this is really important. You know, when you go in so innocently to an experience, you're undefended from it. So that if it's going to impact you, it impacts you very, very deeply. And I heard a voice. I saw a strong image of a Chinese sage, that kind of trope, you know, bald man with the long, wispy white goatee sitting under a tree in a robe, looking at me and saying, just be. You know, and it brings tears to my eyes to talk about it now, because it's making sense to me in my older years exactly what that means to me. Do not manipulate. you know, that there's so much to appreciate already about who we are and who the other person is, that to see that is very fulfilling. And the rest is kind of gibberish. So that transported me. And he said, look, I don't want to do too much more with you, but he sent me to the Self-Transformation Center to do these weekend workshops. It was run by an American guy, Walter Bellin. He's sort of like the Tony Robbins of the 1980s in Sydney. He was from LA.
I've heard of him.
Yeah, we were doing, you know, bioenergetics and past life regression, and you know, we would attack photons and kill, scream our anger out, and weep openly. You know, very much the kind of antidote of what Anglo-Australian culture is, of, you know, stay cheerful and show no weakness. You know,
the upper lip.
Yeah. The Australian version of that is the, you know,
you'll be right, mate.
Rigid edge, mate. In Australia, they say, how's it going? And you say, good, mate, because that's the only answer there is.
Yeah.
And then they reward you for being good. So that's the way, you know. Mm-hmm. Everything else doesn't count, you know. I mean, I'm really stereotyping right now, but it's dry. It's so dry. It's such a shame-based culture. It's a culture of no sensual expression. There's no song. There's very little permission to dance and be ecstatic.
And you've been imbued with that in your first 9 years. So
yeah.
Your cells.
South American people that are warm, they touch you. There's a lot of touching that goes on in the conversation. They're beautiful. They ask you, they're curious. They'll ask you questions about you. They'll hold your forearm to make a point when they want to convey something. And there's dance and song is spontaneous. You might be sitting around a table eating, and then you sing a song together afterwards while you're sitting down, and no one plans it. It just happens. So that permission to be the singing and dancing ape that we are designed to be is joy is available. It's there like a low-hanging fruit. You walk amongst it a lot of the time. I do miss that. I miss that a lot, and I do feel like there's a part of me that switches down when I'm away from that energy. I can't sustain it on my own. I'm interdependent with kind of tribe and environment, and when I go to South America, that part of me tends to switch back up again. And there's
what's wonderful is you have that part of you, and most of us that never had any development, so we're starting from a lot scratchier place. But then you're part of a band, so you did get some singing and music making in your life.
Yeah, it's an interesting way that it's, you know, that where music is about performance rather than participation, and it's about talent rather than inclusion, you know. And so that was, I mean, I'm incredibly grateful for having been given that. And if I didn't have, you know, a society to sing and play with, I could get up on a stage and somebody would give me a couple of $100 at the end of the night, and too much alcohol. And that's the way of it. And that kind of works in its own way. It's ironic, you know, Australia did have a pretty fantastic music industry and produced fantastic musicians and bands in that time, because it was incentivized in the pubs. You know, every second building in Australia is a pub, and you know, so that was rich, and the, you know, that workshopy stuff, so it gave me a subculture that then was no longer the stereotypical Aussie culture. It was completely different from the rest of the space. You know, that the people that would go in their hordes, hundreds and thousands, you know, to do personal growth kind of stuff. It was, and that became a subculture that was, I think, quite nourishing in many ways and exciting. You know, I didn't get to be a hippie. And, you know, I missed that kind of era of, you know, Woodstock, but I caught up on the warmth and playfulness and the spirituality, I guess, of the New Age culture that did give me a lot. And I mean, I laugh about the New Age now, and you know, I'm deeply allergic to the spiritual bypass that it entails.
Yes.
However, it gave me a vehicle and a tribe, really, that I think brought joy back to me that I had lost to a large
And this
degree.
is at the end of your years of doing these boring jobs before you got back into psychology.
That's what brought me back onto psychology being a fascinating thing, because this started to taste good and this started to make sense to me and feel like a kind of a relationship, a therapeutic relationship that's vibrant, alive, soulful. It needed to feel soulful to me. You know, that kind of manipulative authoritarian style of relationship where you're unwell, you're, you know, the disease model of psychology, that you've got the problem, you're unwell, I'm the guy with the technique, I'll apply a technique to you, is, you know, so repellent that it's not, I'm not interested in that. I just feel like aliveness comes back through an interactive kind of a model that's not about you know, psychopathology so much as, you know, how do we relearn how to make contact that feels satisfying to the heart, and then how do we rediscover where our boundaries are about that, so we don't take in too much. You know, the moving towards contact and back towards ourselves, that to me feels like the ultimate, the breathing of human relationship life. And to restore that is the gig that I'm interested in. And that's dialogical and interactive and mutual. It feels human to me. And I learned that by escaping, you know, if I was a refugee from anywhere, it was from university. And probably the biggest influence would have been Chris Campbell, that you know.
Yes.
And the wild, extraordinary encounter groups that he ran and that eventually I assisted on. That was basically a very, very, I think, from the point of view of our culture, quite radical truth-telling environment. I learned a lot about what it means to be intentionally, emotionally vulnerable in those spaces, and spent quite a few years doing that with Chris, learning from Chris's way of seeing and his capacity for presence on that level. And that was a major, probably the greatest single driving force for the way that I work now. Yeah.
Now, was Chris up here? Or was he down there at that point?
He would regularly fly down to. He had a workshop space in Balmain, in the inner west of Sydney, in a wonderful old sandstone home with a big kind of empty lounge room where we would sit together in a circle. And when you're in a room like that, and people really drop down and start to tell the truth of how they feel, it's both. It's so moving. It's deeply, deeply moving, and also kind of wild and uncontrolled sometimes, and frightening. And people would cry together, would fall in love with each other, would be attracted to each other, would be repelled by each other. People would fight and yell and um, I don't think that I would work the same way again. You know, I feel like I need more containment these days. But however, it was what a kind of a crucible, what a sort of like a forge of learning, you know, about where our limits are and what it is that really moves all of us at the heart level. And so yeah, I needed a kind of a structure for what it all means. I needed to have it be articulated in sentences, and that's why I turned to writing after that. It's one thing to have a direct experience, right, of something very transformative and life-changing. But then if I am ever going to communicate that to more than one person at a time, I feel I've got I think I inherited this from my father. I need a sense of structure, like a cerebral structure, how to communicate an experience that's unmeasurable, so that at least awkwardly a sentence in the English language can point to it and describe it. And say, if you want to find this, you'll find it there, you know, in that spot there. That's where my writing comes from.
So now you've decided to hang out a shingle and open a practice?
I did. It was deregulated in those days. I was too brave for my own good and for the good of others. And any fool can be a psychotherapist. Any genius could be a psychotherapist. The good, the bad, and the ugly could be a psychotherapist in the 90s in Australia. So I did hang up my shingle and try to do my best. I did have a lot of experience from the kind of the off-grid training grounds that I had spent years in, you know, including everything, the meditation, the Eastern things and the Western things. And it actually gave me a pretty deep understanding of trauma and early development that was there really solidly way before the whole attachment research became popular and well known and understood, and before what we now call the trauma informed. We were trauma informed. You know, that understanding came through the lineage of the body-oriented psychotherapists, from Wilhelm Reich through Alexander Lowen, and the people that those guys all gave birth to, in a sense. There's a very, very rich literature, you know, and all written in that gorgeous 1970s psychopathological language, you know, that it's funny when you read it now.
Lowen's body.
Yeah. What is it? The schizoid and the oral and the psychopath and the masochist. Yeah, all that stuff. They weren't good at, I mean, for all of their wonderful contributions, those dudes back then, they still did not manage to find escape velocity from the gravitational pull of goddamn Western medicine.
Yeah.
Everything is an illness, right? I've just got a hammer. Everything is a nail. This is all disease. It's just, you know, they didn't, you know, what they did have missing is like a interest in where your wounds are is where your beauty is and where your gifts are, you know, and that story of how the storms of your life and the droughts of your life have broken some of your branches and twisted some of your growth. That unique shape is the most special thing that you have. And the fact that on top of that, you've got all of these kind of automatic defenses, well, that's your automatic self, you know? So to have it like a wonder at that, an awe of that, you know, the language of awe is missing from those old psychopathological texts. And yet, you know, they contributed well. And I had that going for me. So that's how I began as a psychotherapist, doing the body-oriented stuff. Later on, I realized as Australia was becoming more, controlled and hyper controlled, and everyone had to have the assessments and the credentials. And I needed to grow up. I needed to subject myself to scrutiny and not be so kind of, the hubris that you think you know stuff. The humbling hadn't happened yet.
So how in
yeah.
your early years you're seeing clients full-time, part-time?
I saw clients. I was working from a shiatsu center in the city in Sydney. We would sit on futons in the ground, and probably I was seeing about, anywhere from 10 to 20 clients in a week. Catching the ferry to the city in Sydney and riding my bicycle up the road. And, that subculture, which is about organic food, possibly vegetarianism, and everybody being interested in complementary medicines, right? The shiatsus and the acupunctures and the herbalisms and yoga and tai chi, and that universe was very sustaining. And my clients tended to come from that world, or would otherwise find me possibly alienating because of my long hair and my way of dressing. When you're a new age guy, you tend to want to wear clothes that make you look Indian, so that people think you're a white guy in Indian clothing.
Sri Robin.
Thank goodness I stopped short of changing my name.
What happened to the long hair?
What do you think happened?
Same thing in mine.
Man, some things aren't a matter of style; they're a matter of DNA, right? I mean, it's liberating to get a little bit older and to go. I don't really need an image as much as I used to.
And
it's
you're
okay.
Not even 60 yet.
Oh no, I'm working on it though. I'm working on it. It's liberating, actually. Look, there's so much of me that's very conservative, and I'm a bit of a capitalist. I don't mind capitalism. There's a lot about it that I quite like, and I'm excited by it. Neoliberalism is what I hate, but capitalism is pretty cool and useful. And no, I'm quite so not to have to present a particular kind of an image. That's thank goodness that's not quite as important anymore.
So you were doing this somewhat alternative practice for how many years?
Yeah, alternative for a few years, and until I realized I need to go back to university and get my postgraduate so that I can call myself a psychologist. And some of it was, again, not enjoyable. Some of it was, I'm grateful for the discipline, actually. It helped me. The thing that I love about university, it really disciplines you to doubt yourself in a healthy way.
Mm-hmm.
That what you think and what you say is going to be biased. And you need to be subjected to the scrutiny of others, to the peer review. Because, and I love that about science, that my understanding of the philosophy, the soul of science says, if you're human, you're not to be trusted in the way that you see the world.
No such thing as objective measures.
No, that the greatest comedy is the idea that anything can be objective. We're full of I love this, that our ocular nerve connects to the memory centers. And neurologically, what's understood now is possibly up to 90% of what you think you see is memory. Your eye gives you a 10% representation of the world around you. The rest, you're making it up based on the biases of what your hopes or your fears. So from your history, you know, I'm looking at you. I don't know you. I don't see you. I've got like a flood of projections about you from the moment that you appear in my orbit. So, you know, I think you're Jack. You're, you know, you're a universe of something else quite different. And the positive projections are bullshit just as much as the negative. And I, oddly, that gives me kind of comfort, you know, and science recognizes that and says, you know, this is why we need double-blind studies and control studies, because I don't care who you are, you will lie to yourself about the result. You will probably lie to yourself in the way that you ask the question and in the questions that you refuse to even think of asking, because you've already made up your goddamn mind before you walked in the room, dude. And
My mind's made
yeah,
up. Don't confuse me with facts.
that's right. And that's what university did, you know, to actually humble me about, you know, they would say, what the hell do you mean by inner child? What kind of hippie bullshit is that? And show me inner child. What is that? You know, it's kind of good to submit yourself to that kind of inquiry. You know,
Tempering your,
yeah, and it's not that I feel like the world shouldn't have intangibles. Most of the good things are intangible, and joy, it comes from places that you cannot language necessarily or measure in a test tube. However, if I'm going to be talking around the place or saying anything or preaching or teaching, you know, then what the hell do I mean by blah blah blah? So I'd like that university gave me that and taught me how to research and taught me how not to big note myself too much. And if I say something, I need to at least make an effort in backing it up and support it with what other human beings have found. We're alone. I think we're much more likely to be self-deluded. It's the group brain, the crowd brain, that really starts to make sense. And I think that's the essence of what democracy means. There's the wisdom is of the mass. If you let me run a country, I'll become a dictator within 2 years and do harm. I don't care what a good guy I might think I am. Power over doesn't work, but democracy, I believe in. That's my religion, in that it's the collective consciousness tends to make life-giving decisions.
Mm. So you've gone back and gotten what kind of degree or postgraduate?
Well, I it was a graduate diploma of counseling, which felt like going back to kindergarten for me in terms of you know, the skills that I was learning, that I'd learned, I think, in a much better way from all of those other kind of non-academic workshops that I'd spent years doing. However, they did teach me the discipline of research and that gave me just enough to register as a psychologist. The rest is, for me, education will go until I die, because it never stops being so interesting and fascinating. And in terms of reading and listening to other people and having, you know, exposing myself to experiences that will impact me about human relationship. And yeah, I think I'm overdue another workshop of some kind. If I can find somebody I feel inspired by, I'd really appreciate it.
So now that you open another practice after your grad dip?
Yeah, I continued with the same, but then I could call myself a psychologist. And then in Australia, you that means that you can offer, you know, rebates under private health insurance, or even the government thing, the Medicare, which is Australia is generous in that regard compared to other countries. So I've kept my practice going But then that changed. I'd spend less time face to face with clients when I started writing, which is how you discovered my work, I believe, through my books.
Well, or through Mitch telling me about you.
Mitch wrote the foreword to my first book, Parenting for a Peaceful World. Mitch
Yeah.
Hall in San Francisco.
Yeah, we'll be getting him on here as well. So what date are we talking now? 90s, late 90s, or?
I started the research for that without realizing it because, and that was in the 90s. And then I started writing some articles in parenting magazines as a result of the research I was doing, based on my discovery that, when I'm working one-on-one with people, their story really matters. And, you tell your story, particularly of your formative years, and we both get some really huge aha moments from that. I love that moment of, no wonder you react in those ways. No wonder you're...
I think you call it a eureka moment in your latest book, right?
The no wonder moment.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, I'm not going to give that to the ancient Greeks. The no wonder moments. And I love that. I love those moments. But it's the same with not just one-to-one. I discovered it's exactly the same with a nation or a culture or a tribe. That the way that children have been treated in the more kind of recent generations really shows you everything about the way that the nation behaves, the way the politics of the nation, the way that the nation, its international policy, foreign policy. People think that that's a rationally arrived at decision, the foreign policy of a nation. It's incredibly reflects the wounding or the love that a kind of a critical mass of its children have received. And we grow up, who was it that said, the way you treat a child, that child will treat the world? You can really well understand national behavior.
I think that was Menninger said that.
Right. It makes sense. It's a forgiveness thing for me. You instead of thinking the Germans must have been, monsters because of the Holocaust. There's Holocausts in so many nations. There's the Australian Holocaust. Any nation can end up in that position. It has zero to do with ethnicity. When you understand the way childhood determines a nation's future, you become almost accidentally and helplessly forgiving, because it removes the judgment. You go inescapably, well, no wonder if that's what happened to the children, 30% of the children or more, well, no wonder people behave that way. Humans we get broken and we get vicious when we are trampled and abandoned enough. That's just a mathematical formula. And you can give therapy is super helpful, but you're not going to put an entire country in therapy. So that in the 90s I started discovering all of that work. Psychohistorians from around the world, Lloyd the Mouse in New York, and the wonderful journal that he and all his people published, and a ton of books that were coming out about the history of childhood, and it made so much sense. Alice Miller was brilliant. God, she was a powerful writer. God, everyone was so asleep. It feels to me like people were in this kind of trance that it doesn't matter what you do to a child.
Yeah.
It really was that.
Still
absolutely. Well, that's still there, but there's been, the progress has been strong, because that kind of rhetoric, like you can do whatever you want to a baby because they won't remember, that is dying. It's a kind of you would have to be scientifically completely illiterate to say that out loud these days, because the evidence is an absolute shutout. The evidence is in our own bodies, but we tend to not listen to that. We'll listen to a scientist, okay? So, well and good. So yeah, that I'd tell you that was thrilling. I wanted to run around and tell everybody this. I got so excited. I felt like I'd stumbled on a kind of a treasure that basically, look, it made me feel like a overexcited child. I wanted to run around saying, hey, look at this. If we want to stop wars, it's completely doable. You treat the child like their emotions matter, and you make that a matter of policy in the nation. And then even the way that we treat the non-human environment comes right out of wounding, psychological wounding. You know,
my daughter and her work with the animals and
yeah,
the horrible conditions that meat eaters inflict on the animal kingdom. Now, I had a similar passion when I discovered both Lidloff and Prescott and his awareness that peaceful cultures carried their babies, that simple attachment through carrying was a huge factor. And now you mentioned that you started this before you'd heard about attachment, but you clearly
well,
were.
only because that word wasn't being used yet, and it hadn't been formalized into the kind of laboratory research that then Mary Ainsworth put out in the stranger situation experiment. What was it called?
Strange situation,
Yeah.
Literally view
And
self.
the adult attachment inventory, and that just gave birth to a gigantic kind of a science. But the kind of work that we were doing is that we would be doing regressive body work, vegetotherapy, hypno kind of work, where we would actually recall quite directly the feeling of being a baby. And sometimes what would come with that is even the visual memory, the narrative memory of that. But mostly it was the feeling. And boy, I really connected with what it felt like to be a baby young enough to be before sitting up and lying on a mattress or cot somewhere in a darkened room, calling out, and nobody would come. And with my arms out. And the feeling of despair that all there was darkness. And just being enveloped and consumed by this God Almighty overwhelming panic. So that was a resting recall. It really it really informed me about where my social insecurities had these deep roots. You know, that part of me that no longer trusts all the way. Where the part of me that won't show my heart all the way because, somewhere my body has said, I have said, I never want to go through that ever again. And I feel it. I feel how that just seeps into my interactions, that core kind of place. And of course, that's not the only thing. There was also moments of love and affection and warmth. There was wounding that happened even before that, right, in my mother's womb. But to have remembered that stuff before I had the written information about it, you didn't need to convince me about any of it. I remember the day when somebody said to me, "Oh man, that's called attachment." And I said, "That's a pretty weird word. I don't like it. Why would you, it's sticky and yucky and it sounds too clinical for me." But I started reading the modern kind of, well, at the time it felt modern, attachment literature. And I thought, wow, it sounds so clinical. I mean, I know exactly what it's talking about. I've been living it with people for years. We all visited those places. And it's so much more than attachment. Attachment is dominant right now because that's the one that gets the science. I think we think that it's all about attachment. I don't feel so. Attachment is one of the stages and really, really foundational, but there's things before attachment. And then there's quite different developmental needs that happened after that time of life that is almost entirely about attachment. You know, it's more interesting than that, but it's just that the science hasn't quite caught up with that, not to the same level. So we're kind of in the age right now where attachment is king or queen. That will pass. There's a much larger. I think Erik Erikson was really on the money. He had several stages of development that really make sense and are very grounded in the body, right? In the neurobiology of things, that thing that we all pass through. Every human on earth, doesn't matter where you come from and what your language is or what your color is. We all, on some essential level, pass through those same stages with the nourishment and the wounding and whatever the mix of that is. And our behavior and our relationships come out of that to quite a large degree, and our gifts. So
now we're leading up to your publishing your first book, which was in what, 27 or?
The first book came out in 2005. That was Parenting for a Peaceful World. That was, quite a socio-political, sociological book, anthropological book. And it was an education for myself as much as I'm really, really pleased with the response that the book has had and the impact that it's had. The only reservation is that it feels like it's immensely popular amongst a very, very tiny subset of people. Gosh, we all want more, don't we? But that was the history of childhood, was the first part of that book. And then the neuropsychology of why, then I go on to explain why childhood is so formative for the way that we behave collectively. And it ends in a pretty upbeat place, because there is so much evidence that as we address children's emotional needs, little by little, a little bit more with each new generation, there is a peace dividend. It's very, very, very clear and very measurable. Human violence has gotten a lot less as we take care of, we as parents, we're more than providers. We take care of that heart-to-heart connection with our kids. And a lot of people don't know that yet, and you watch TV and you'd be surprised, but human-to-human violence of every kind has been plummeting. Mm-hmm. It's not our only problem. Violence is not our only problem, and some things are getting worse.
Depression and addiction.
Screen addiction is having, and everything that comes with screens for young people, that's having a massive dissociative effect. I think it's changing brains. It's making detached people who are losing the ability to interact, and interacting with each other is hard. It takes practice, it takes commitment, and it takes willingness to have some pain, because you aren't symbiotic to me. You're different. It's not going to work with you very well. We need to keep working at the connection. So the screen gives you this. The screen's a drug. It's heroin. Nothing matters. You can just disappear down a rabbit hole of your own fantasy world and the delusion of connectedness. I'm deeply worried about that. But violence is getting better.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So now we're in the aughts, the middle of the aughts. You're still doing your practice. You've got one book out. You're working on the second book.
Then I Well, I was asked to write the second book, Heart to Heart Parenting, by a scout.
Really?
Yeah, my editor for my first book um, persuaded me to enter my first book in a competition in Australia for um, self-published books, and it came second. It got a really nice commendation, and unbeknownst to me, there was a wonderful ulterior motive in that competition, in that one of the judges was a scout who, you know, took that book, and he called me and said, "Look, it's a great book. I've got contacts in publishing businesses, and I'm going to get a cut of the deal if you write that book for him again." And I said, "That's what this was about." But I loved him. What a great guy. You know, if you're going to have an ulterior motive, make it be a good one.
Uh-huh.
And yeah, he said, yeah, I said, I refuse to write that book again. I'm never going to do something like that again. That almost killed me. Uh, it almost killed me. The attention to detail, I'm not good at that. You've been my editor. I can't, it's torture for me to go into fine detail. I can't do
Got
it.
to have some Virgo.
Well, God made me a Virgo and it failed. Didn't work. It didn't take. So I said, no, I'm not going to do that, but I will write. And HarperCollins was the publisher. I wrote Heart to Heart Parenting, and which is more a conversation with mums and dads. And I have been, what I love about the attachment kind of conversation that we were all having is, I could fill pages with saying what I appreciate about it, and it's been great for the world. There's also what it really dissatisfies me in the attachment parenting literature that irritates me. That, there's all these ticker box things like, if you do the co-sleeping, if you do the full-term breastfeeding, if you, do the baby wearing, and there's these ticker box lists, that's going to make the difference, which is a big part of the truth, of course. But I've met too many people that do all of those things and they're miserable. And their babies and their children are violent and attack the mothers. And I'm being very literal right now. People, I've so many people from the attachment parenting community have come to me and they look just like drained and sad and empty, and there's no intimacy between the parents. And often it's what surprises me. Geez, you're supposed to have a child that is just, a picture of joy and wisdom and sensitivity. And in fact, you have a toddler who's punching the mother in the stomach in a rage and biting, and the frustration about the doing that has no pleasure in it. And I guess the major driving force of writing that book for parents was, why is there no pleasure in parenting? Because if you bring that, to the breastfeeding, that kind of, okay, it says so in the book, let's be gentle when inside I'm feeling empty or angry, frustrated. It's the quality of presence. Now, our kids know exactly where we're at. And the attachment parenting handbooks don't stress that anywhere near strongly enough.
Mm-hmm.
Then I think you're almost better off weaning a bit earlier, but just being loved in your community and restoring yourself and finding ways that it's a pleasure to come to that contact moment. Less of it, but more truth in it, and would do. And so that book is a lot about, what do parents need in order to be attached, in order to have the capacity. And there's a massive sacrifice of parents. A lot of it is self-sacrifice.
Which Dean Liedloff used to always say to me, the child should be in the center of attention, not be the center of attention. And as I watched my granddaughters be the center of attention, because it's a nuclear family, there's no community, there's no extended tribe, so you're stuck with these kids 24/7.
Yeah,
And
that nuclear family was a wrong turn in history, and it's been
yeah,
like it's dropped a nuclear bomb on. You've said this. You've come to this conclusion through your reading. I've heard you say it many times. There are 4 people it takes per child, 4 adults. It's
3.87.
yeah, there you go.
Got to be scientific.
That's right. Which grandparent gets to be 0.87 of a person? But yeah, that's realistic. We're built that way. We're nuclear family is a case of mistaken identity. That's the wrong animal. We're a
Both a nuclear family disaster.
yeah, the nuclear bomb of modern society.
Yeah.
You can't do it. It can't be done. By definition, your baby will ask for more energy from you than you have,
Hmm.
even if there's 2 of you.
And then it destroys your primary relationship in most cases because you're clueless and you're overwhelmed, and all your energy is going into the baby, and so they
Yeah, yeah. Dads feel abandoned, unloved, bewildered, alone, useless, unnecessary. Mums feel, because all of their life is drained by the baby, mums feel prickly, cranky,
Mhm.
irritable, untouchable, um, resentful, and bitter. A
Yeah,
lot of that happens. And then to compound the tragedy is that there's all the self-blame about that. What's wrong with me? What's wrong with you? The
yeah,
shame. And all of that doesn't happen when, we have needs for connection and contact with other adults. No, it's not always sexual. Sometimes sexual gets in the way. It is sometimes sexual, sometimes it's the telling the truth to one another,
hmm,
playing, touch. We have needs for being in the wild amongst nature. We have needs to express some unique creativity in ourselves, and you start to starve those needs, and it doesn't matter how many boxes you tick for the kids, you aren't there anymore.
yeah,
And your kids also, they don't pick up on what you do, they pick up on how you are.
yeah,
And the lack of affection and enjoyment, the mum and dad, or these days dad and mum and mum, whoever you are, the lack of playfulness with one another, the lack of, you can tell when somebody's enjoying the other person because the
hmm,
body is incapable of telling a lie.
yeah,
And that's what communicates to the child and the baby. They understand that perfectly from inside the womb. You don't need to have a spoken language for that.
yeah.
All right. So that was a book trying to say, people, we need a lot of that holding for us, and and a lot of what makes us short-tempered and empty with our children is because we had childhoods that were about emotional deprivation for the most part.
And now we're getting to your third book, and it was when Sue Johnson said, and I think it's Hold Me Tight, that a couple needs as much affection as a baby does in terms of
Yeah.
interacting with each other. It's like, wow, yeah. So,
Oh yeah. Well, we need affection. We need space. We need a place to express what is inside us to express. There's kind of a rainbow of the emotional needs,
mhm,
and connection isn't always affection. It has other colors as well.
yeah,
There's something about the truth telling that is deeply, deeply satisfying.
to be
Even
known
when
and to know and be known is how
there
I,
you go. Yeah. And that comes in moments. It's not like
yeah,
a static. It's we need these moments of docking with
yeah.
nature, with each other, and with ourselves. Just moments. It doesn't take long. Otherwise, we then starve, and then we pass that starvation to the kids.
So now, as we're getting short on time here, you're at this point crowning achievement, which I've witnessed over how many years? Your third book.
it was on and off for 7 years. I wasn't, gosh, I really, I wrestled with that one a lot. I was getting a lot of kind of, I was discouraged from completing it. And, I did have people in my life that said, I advise you against writing that because parents want to hear what to do to their child to make things go happy.
Yeah.
They don't want to hear that they have issues to work with. And there's that magical word, nobody. Nobody wants to hear that.
Yeah.
And I was given that kind of
Really.
negativity quite a bit. So I felt alone in writing it, in that I wrote it quite a bit from a space of, this is what I feel and I believe, and I love this dialogue, and I'm writing it, and there's going to be 23 people that will read it, and I'm going to be lonely, but I had that kind of, it was a bit of a gloomy space a lot of the time of not trusting that it would move this book. But,
Just for our viewers' sake, it's
yeah,
called Inner Child Journeys.
Inner Child Journeys, How Our Children Grow Us Up. And it's got zero advice on what to do or say for your children. None, not a speck. I'm not interested in that anymore. It's about, I mean, this is exciting for me. So I do feel excited about it. There's, when you look at the stuff that comes up again and again with our kids, that's where they pressed the button, and the button was ours. We tend to
Yes.
blame the child or blame ourselves. We judge the child, we judge ourselves. What's wrong with the kid? What's wrong with me? Someone has to pay the price, right? And that's kind of the root of all evil, that moment. And when you see that the button that's being pressed, often quite painfully, by your child being themselves and the way that they are, it links to a wound. There's a part of you that's been calling, please pay attention to me. We're hurting down here, until that comes into your face from your child pressing that button, you're just as likely to completely abandon that part of yourself. Suddenly it's a gift, and you go back in a child journeying. I've got the kind of the map for that in my book, for how to have a conversation with that wounded place that you were ignoring. And underneath that pain or that frustration, there's always a need, a developmental need.
Mm-hmm.
And a developmental need is not like a need for chocolate or for going to the movies. A developmental need is core. It's like a need for really core things, like being heard and seen more, or a need to set better boundaries, or a need to express your craft, or a need to be alone and left alone, or a need for being protected, or a need to reach out and say, I love you. There's these core developmental needs. And then, the crap you've gone through with your kid is bringing that to your attention if you listen. And then the beautiful part for me is that the need that hasn't been completely met from your own childhood, you can catch up with that now. Mm-hmm. At 75 years of age, it's never, ever, ever too late. And there is an adult appropriate version of how we can nourish that place, the developmental nutrient that matches that developmental need. So that completes the cycle. That if our kids had not pressed on that button, we could go to our deaths without knowing that about ourselves. So the healing opportunities, the liberation opportunities are huge. And there's additional payoffs, one being that the more we contact the inner adolescent, inner child, inner baby, etc., the more close and intimate we become with that place in ourselves, we start to understand our children's behavior so much better, much more intuitively. We start to be able to get ahas much more clearly about what children do and say. We start to be able to decode their often bewildering indirect behaviors. we understand others through understanding ourselves.
Now, how much of this, much of my work has been out of my own experience of two marriages falling apart as a result of having children. One of them took 2.5 years, the other one took 18 years. But and that is the wound that has led to my work in the relationship abandonment syndrome. How much of your premise comes out of your own experience of having a daughter and being a parent?
Oh, quite a lot of it. I mean, a wealth of this came out of my work, because this is the way that I've been working with people for a very long time now. But I knew, before my daughter was conceived, that I knew then that that trip would bring back to me everything that is still there for me to work with and work on in myself. And, from the day of her birth, and I was present there, she was born at home, and that was a panic moment for me. And I sat with it. I knew what was happening. I knew what was coming up was out of my own birth trauma.
Mm-hmm.
So I sat with that, and it enabled me to be, to take in what was happening and to be helpful when I was needed, and but I was partially numbed when I was there. This kind of expectation of it being a violent thing, birth, which it was in the time of when my mum was giving birth to children. It was terribly violent. The over medicalization thing that was going on in South America. So, and of course, my mum made sure that she told me very, very clearly how horrible it was for her to give birth.
Yeah.
It was entirely insensitive to what it meant.
Just what you needed to hear.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So I still hadn't, I was still carrying that in me. And you think you work with that stuff, but when you go to the actual coal face, wow, you feel it on a whole other level. For me, actually, her teenage years were probably the biggest. It brought up the most difficult parts of myself to deal with. Out of the whole time, I quite enjoyed her being a baby and a toddler. I didn't really mind the tantrum side of toddlers. It's hard work, it's tiring, but I felt really kind of well to sit with her and her crazy toddler stuff. I found it quite awesome, actually. The power of human emotionality, But the teenage stuff scared the hell out of me, and it pushed me back into therapy. Actually, I found there was still so much about my own life as a teenager that I hadn't taken care of.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of huge conflicts with my father, and teenage stuff still frightens me quite a bit. And it's just that I find it difficult to know that I can trust the process. Partly because the stakes are higher. Teenagers play dangerous games when they're bold and powerful enough and secure enough to play them. My daughter went and traveled South America alone at 19 years of age for months. She was out of range and out of communication for big periods of it. And she went driving around Australia and alone in a van that she kind of built, and etc. A lot of stuff that she goes in her own way. I know that I feel safer if she just went to university or something and just, studied quietly in a room someplace. But it made me realize how anxious I am and how untrusting I can be about the spirit of adventure. So that's been a big impetus for me to heal that part of me. In a nutshell, I don't think I completed that part of my own development well, or even halfway. So
Still
I'm
got
planning to actually is to have like a 60-year-old, 59-year-old version of some of what I did not complete when I was 19. That's coming next year. I do get some of that. I go traveling a lot with my work. I get invited to speak around the country and overseas quite a bit, and that feels incredibly playful to me. Just throw my swag on my shoulder and show up someplace and play with a microphone and meet people, and it does make me feel like I'm 20 years old, a lot of that stuff. I love it to pieces, and it's always a surprise where I end up. But no, next year it's going to be more. We're going to go live. My wife and I, Linda, we're going to go live in South America for a few months, and I won't be working, as it were. Just playing and having days that are without a plan. Days without achievement, without an objective.
Yeah, that's the big challenge of retirement that I've dealt with for some years. Is my projects have decreased in the structure they provide, and being as opposed to being a human doing.
And we call it retirement because there's a shared collective trance that it's about. That's a negative word. It's about no longer doing the thing. In fact, so if you think about it, the name that we use is about what it isn't. It's like saying alternative medicine. It's so disempowering because if you call it alternative medicine, it's by virtue of something else as being the point of reference. The real medicine is this. This is only alternative. The real life is when you're working. This is just retirement from that.
What should we call it? We got a better name?
It has to be a word, not yet, but it has to be a word it's intentional. Like an intention to have a journey and an adventure into the power of not doing.
How about fulfillment, if we're going to have
more specific than that? More specific, because you can be fulfilled from being 21 and playing your guitar and sleeping with your girlfriend, okay? Or your boyfriend, or whoever you got. That's pretty fulfilling. You can be fulfilled from running a business, So no, this is it's I wanted for me to be dynamic, and I'll probably always be working on something, whether I'm getting paid or not, but also dynamic, non-doing. And then that has something in it to communicate to others. Gosh, I mean, when I meditate, I'm retiring, aren't I? Every morning when I meditate. You get nothing done. You're useless when you meditate. Right?
I'm just reminded that this zero budget project lets me have an hour and a half to rap with folks like you and maybe provide a product in the end. But even if not, it sure is fun.
Yeah, I like that. I like that. Yeah, and I like that. This is, if this is retirement, then God damn, it feels pretty good to me. We're creating, and there wasn't a deadline on this thing. There's was it Oscar Wilde that says the game of golf is just an excuse to go for a walk in a park? What you really wanted is the walk in the park, and then you called it game of golf to justify it. And the Course in Miracles, which was a crazy, damn spiritual practice I did about 3 times in my life, even though I wrestled with it and I hated a lot of it, but I still stuck to it. And a lot of it I really, really loved. And it says in there, the Course in Miracles, if you know about that thing.
Yeah.
Yeah. on the presumption that there's such thing as a soul and a spirit and a God, you know, which I have no idea. But there's a thing that says that when you do something with a friend or with a colleague, or you know, you pick up the phone to call someone, you think you're calling them for this business. You don't really know why.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, the only thing you ever do is to connect. Everything else is an excuse for it. It's like the game of golf. I believe that, actually. It makes a lot of sense to me.
Is it Gottman that came up with the expression of everything's a bid for connection?
I don't know Gottman, but I think everything is a bid for connection.
Yeah.
It makes every sense. And Fritz Perls, the Gestalt dude, you know, that he mapped it quite nicely about how the only thing we ever do is that we reach out to touch and then we withdraw, because we need to then come back to connecting with ourselves. It gets tiring to connect with another person. It's like food. Then that's enough. That's too much now.
Mm-hmm.
Overwhelming. And that's a rhythm. It's all this pulse.
In and out.
Yeah. And
forward to backward, yeah.
And sometimes the connection isn't with another human. It's with non-human life forms. Okay? Wilderness. Your
Or
dog.
pet. Yeah, like
Yeah.
dogs are real obvious with their bids for connection. They're in your face.
Licking your face.
Yeah.
See, I don't do that. I don't lick anybody's face.
Well,
call it a weakness, but I don't. But I'm not like a dog that way. I'm like a dog in some other ways.
well, Robin, this has been such a delight. Do you have any final words of wisdom for our viewers? If we're going to wrap up here.
That's a big ask, Jack. Final words of wisdom?
Well, in the moment.
You know, retired, yes, but dead, not necessarily.
Yeah. Speaking of dogs, we've got.
Yeah, they knew we were talking about them. They're all showing up. I'm very, 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 you know, what I'm constantly thinking about right now is how terrified I am of where we are collectively in this moment in history, how depressed I feel about it and helpless. And climate is the central thing. Climate and plastics, we're dying. And the reality of that is so overwhelming that most of the time I disconnect from it. But there's no denying. And I'm also intrigued and excited by what this can bring, because together we declared war on nature as if we're not part of it about 12,000 years ago. And since then we've been at war with each other. To be dominators of nature, you know, from the moment that we took all of our food out of ecology, and ecology has been trying to take it back. So we call it weeds or pests. And our infectious diseases came from that, by being outside of the ecology. Most infectious diseases, the plague proportions, came from that. And there's always violence, but the really chronic pathological violence and organized violence came from that. From the moment that we separated and then became dominators, you know, and that's our story, our shared story for most of the world. And the only way to maintain that kind of culture is by declaring war on children. And we have been at war against children to make them more obedient or warlike or both ever since. And there's, in 12,000 years, there has not been a moment when we don't get to think like that this is successful. You know, we think that if we fail at being dominator culture, we can always move somewhere else or become better dominators. We just right now because of climate change, global warming, and it's out of control right now. It's for the first time that it's completely clear that this is it's not going to work. We can't think it's working because it's not. War is not successful. It's killing us and threatening the lives of so many species, beginning with our own. So it's over. It's game over time.
Yeah.
I'm excited by that. I'm excited by the fact that the only way, you know, there's one way out of the burning building and only one way out, which is to ditch the dominator culture and become the partners of nature, the members of nature. If we don't retool all the way down to our DNA, into our deepest impulses in that way, partnership, the relationship-oriented thing, we die and we take half the world with us. That's an interesting moment. There's never been anything like it. It's also the end of countries and tribes. That's all over. That magic thinking, that's gone. Because there's nothing that says interdependent system. There's nothing that says that like climate.
Yeah.
You know, it's, I mean, right now, you start a fire in Mullumbimby and you're impacting somebody in Poland, right? It's, and vice versa. What people do in Siberia has a direct impact on your personal life tomorrow, right here in Australia, et cetera, everything, you know, this is forcing a birth into interconnectivity, consciousness and awareness as the base from which all actions must flow, or we die. So that means completely redoing the male-female relationship into an equal partnership, completely redoing childhood. It's no more punishment and reward, but listening, emotional authenticity. Authoritarianism must go or we die. We're not the boss anymore. It's done. So, you know, that's why I'm excited about this in equal measure as I'm terrified. It's something worth contemplating. You know, I want to say to people that this could be a really good moment where the new begins, And the flow-on impact would be health, actually, and a much more joyous style of civilization. All of the tools are here: regenerative agriculture that makes more money for the farmer, healthier food, regenerates the soil, draws down carbon from the atmosphere. The circular economy, where everything we make must be part of a cycle, so zero waste. All of the technologies for that are here and completely renewable. We got an endless stream of sunlight and wind forever. All of the tech is here. The only thing in the way is our wounding, that we are addicted to power over styles of relationship. That's the only thing that this is about. And there's the reward of teaching that style the rewards are huge. It feels important for me to language it in that way, because it has implications for everything that we do: parenting, healing modalities, the way our partnerships, the way we treat one another, our gardening, our food.
I first learned about this in the early 80s when Marin was doing work with feminist spirituality, and then we did weekend workshops from domination to partnership with helping professionals, because they're
Yep.
in the dominator model in spades, the whole medical
Oh,
system.
God, yes.
And the cost, before that we've been done preventing burnout, but the burnout is a side effect of the dominator model. So yeah, it's still with us, and well summarized, Robin. I think this a great wrapping up point, and thank you for being in my life, being in the world, all your wonderful contributions, and till the next chapter.
Oh, well, I appreciate that. I've really enjoyed chatting with you. It's actually, you know, it's a really kind thing that you do to ask us for our story. So I really, really appreciate that.
And I think it's
And
important for people to know that,
yeah,
in terms of recognizing the importance of their own story. So thank you for being so open. And
my pleasure.
okay.
Take care.